Iran is once again under pressure for its nuclear program. The UN has reimposed sanctions that were lifted under the 2015 nuclear deal. Tehran insists its program is peaceful, but Western countries say it's not. So, what's next in this long-standing crisis? And does diplomacy still stand a chance? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. So, Iran is under new pressure for its nuclear programme. European powers have reimposed sanctions that were lifted as part of the landmark 2015 nuclear agreement. They target Iran's banking, oil and other crucial sectors. There's also an embargo on arms imports. Western allies say Iran has not been cooperating with the UN nuclear watchdog and that its nuclear program poses a threat to international security. Tehran has always maintained its nuclear program is for civilian use and says it's ready to weather the storm. So, is the Iran nuclear deal dead? Is there still room for diplomacy? And how far are each side willing to go? We'll get to our panel in just a few moments, but first, this report from Fintan Monahan.
The UN is the heart of international diplomacy, but it's here that the last-ditch efforts to save the Iran nuclear deal appear to have failed. European nations are reimposing UN sanctions. They say Iran isn't cooperating with UN nuclear inspectors and isn't serious about further negotiations.
All avenues for an agreement were explored with the Iranian delegation. With great regret, Iran persisted in its refusal.
Iran is defying the global non-proliferation regime. Iran's nuclear escalation, as detailed in over 60 IAEA reports over the past 6 years, is a threat to international peace and security.
Iran has been stockpiling highly enriched uranium. It's believed to have 400 kilos at 60% purity, which is close to weapons grade. But it's always maintained its nuclear program is only for civilian use. With sanctions now in place, President Masoud Pezeshkian says his country is prepared for the worst.
Ultimately, it's not as if the sky will fall and we will have to surrender if they go through with the snapback. The reality is that with the measures we have in place, with the relationships we maintain, we will be able to overcome the situation.
The 2015 nuclear deal saw Iran agree to curb its nuclear program in exchange for an end to international sanctions. But in 2018, US President Donald Trump withdrew from the agreement. European countries continued to engage with Iran to try and make the deal work. But in June this year, Israel and the United States launched attacks on Iranian nuclear sites. This happened just days after the UN nuclear watchdog declared that Iran was not complying with its anti-proliferation obligations. With Europeans now reimposing sanctions, the deal appears all but dead. On the streets of Tehran, many people are worried. Iran's economy is already struggling, and the sanctions will likely make things worse.
What do people really want? Just a simple life, a decent income, enough to keep the household going. Prices have gone out of control.
We are worried because our children's future is at risk.
Iran appears determined to continue with its nuclear program, something Western powers say is a threat to global security. But with diplomacy now sidelined, the way forward is now unclear. And there's growing risk that the situation may spiral out of control. Fintan Monahan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's take a closer look at the snapback mechanism used to reimpose sanctions on Iran. The mechanism was part of the JCPOA, which is the 2015 nuclear deal between Iran and world powers. Any party is able to declare Iran non-compliant within the terms of the agreement. And this begins a process that results in UN sanctions being reimposed on Iran. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has rejected the move, calling it unfair, unjust, and illegal. All right, let's get straight into our guests. In London, we have Ellie Geranmayeh, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, also a specialist in Europe-Iran relations. In Washington, D.C., Mark Fitzpatrick, a former US diplomat and Associate Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and also a founding member of the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium. And in Ottawa, in Canada, we welcome Mazi Khalilian, who is an Iranian political analyst and academic researcher at Carleton University, focusing on US-Middle East relations. A warm welcome to each of you. And Mazi, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. So now the E3, that's the UK, France and Germany, they hope that the threat of triggering this snapback mechanism would have been the leverage required to get Iran to do what they wanted. But Iran has resisted. Why is that? Why not get back to the negotiating table? And why not allow inspectors?
To answer this question, we need to understand that things don't happen in a void. JCPOA happened after 10 whole years of negotiation, after 10 years of intense negotiation between Iran and the P5+1. And it was supposed to be a mutual trust. It was supposed to be Iran abandoning its a lot of its nuclear activities in response for sanction relief and the economic benefits that were supposed to come with it. But 2018, what we see was US President Donald Trump withdrawing from the deal and reimposing sanctions on Iran. In a way, what happened was Iran still had to fulfill its commitment under the deal, but not seeing the economic benefit that were supposed to come with the said deal. So it just makes things a lot more difficult now that within the past few years, EU failed to fulfill its commitment. EU was supposed to at least help deliver the economic benefits that were promised to Iran to come with the deal, but they never happened.
So Iran would say that the fault is on the side of the EU and the United States. Ellie, if the threat of snapback didn't work, why would implementing the snapback achieve what they want? Or is it just that Iran's bluff has been called?
Well, you could argue that actually it's Europe's bluff that has been called here, because my sense was that the hope from the E3 was that the pressure of time and the fact that Iran had come out of the 12-day war with Israel, placing it in its weakest position yet on both the nuclear issue, but also its position in the region and domestically at home, would make Iran cave into the three demands that the E3 had made in order to have the snapback mechanism extended for a period of time. And Iran didn't blink on these three demands. It did try at the 11th hour at the UN General Assembly to put forward some creative solutions to try and, at least in Iran's view, meet the Europeans halfway. Now, the Europeans themselves didn't budge on their demands either. And it could have been because essentially they couldn't get the Americans on board. It could have been that in their view what Iran was offering was just too little, too late. Or it may have worryingly, in my view, been an indication that the E3 has some time ago reached the conclusion that it needs to join the maximum pressure campaign adopted by the Trump administration against Iran to get to this so-called zero enrichment deal that President Trump has put forward on the table, which Iran has resisted.
Mark, what are your thoughts about this? And couldn't it not be argued that the snapback mechanism was, in a sense, the West's last bullet, and now they've pulled the trigger? Where's the leverage?
Yeah, I think it could be argued that way, Nick. But now that snapback is in place, all of the sanctions of the previous time are reimposed. And that's a lot of leverage, actually, because if it imposes more damage to the Iranian economy, they have a greater incentive to try to get out of the hole, to try to seek some kind of a diplomatic solution. So I don't think the leverage is lost.
Okay, Mazi, let's explore that damage that Mark's talking about there to the Iranian economy that these sanctions bring in. What do these sanctions actually mean on the ground? I mean, the currency has already been severely hit. People are already struggling. But what does it really mean, Mazi, for those trying to bring food to the table and so forth?
Yes, exactly. That's what I think too. I think it's going to hit ordinary people the most. It's not going to hit people. It's not going to hit the elite. The elites are cushioned, but it's going to hit the ordinary people as it did prior to 2015 JCPOA deal. What it means is exactly what you said: unemployment, rising in food crisis, rising literally everything, and without currency already plunging to a historical low. It's now 1 million per US dollar. And it means youth will try to migrate. It means brain drain. It means instability for ordinary Iranians. And it's ordinary Iranians who have to pay the price of these sanctions.
And Ellie, is that instability a concern to the Iranian administration? There's always the potential for unrest in Iran.
Look, I think that the Iranian leadership is just in firefighting mode at the moment for several years. They've had nationwide protests 2 years ago, which were the most, I think, pivotal in terms of scale and size and opposition since the 1979 revolution. You have had now Iran coming out of an unprecedented war with two nuclear powers, the United States and Israel. And you have, as your guest put it, a currency in freefall that is affecting the youth in particular. Added to that, by the way, you have environmental issues, lack of water, and year-on-year drought. So there's a lot of both internal pressure and external pressure on the Iranian leadership. But in my view, the sanctions that have snapped back as of recently at the UN Security Council level are not going to massively change the calculations of the Iranian leadership. They have already taken on the brunt of the sanctions because of the US maximum pressure policy that has been continuous since Trump's first term, really. And we'll have to see to what extent the Trump administration wants a face-off with China over essentially enforcing these UN sanctions to go after Iranian oil exports. And that's a big question mark for me, whether the Trump administration wants to have that conflict with China over this. And I think from the Iranian leadership perspective, as long as that export route remains for its oil resources, they can just muddle through. The big question is going to be how they respond to a potential and, in my view, quite likely resumption of Israeli airstrikes at some point in the coming months.
Mark, that issue of China and Russia, indeed, the snapback has been triggered, but what about those countries, and will they continue to support Iran? They did their best to avert the snapback at the UN Security Council on Friday.
Well, there's no doubt that Russia and China will continue to support Iran, particularly Russia, given its military partnership with Iran, which has been providing missiles for use against Ukraine. And that's one point about the snapback, that Russia and China are not going to implement the sanctions. So the additional impact economically is not as great as one might think, but I think other guests have already pointed out the impact on the currency exchange rate. There's also impacts on Iran's ability to do banking, which already were restricted, but now will be harder. So no doubt there will be pain in the Iranian economy, but they have friends. Iran has a look east policy looking toward China and Russia for diplomatic and trade ties that will continue.
Sure. Mark, I just want to get your views very briefly, if you would, on this, to what degree the United States and Israel would want to foment unrest within the country. How much is that part of their calculation here?
I don't think it's part of the United States calculation. It's never been a policy of regime change. Of course, everyone in the Trump administration would be very happy if there were a different regime, but it's not an enunciated policy, and I don't think it's even a secret policy. Israel's policy is different, and they did seem to be seeking regime change, but they didn't do it very systematically. if they wanted to do it, and maybe Ellie is right that there could be a resumption of Israeli bombing to try to foment regime change. But I hope that cooler heads would prevail in Israel and realize that that's not going to be possible to impose a change of government from abroad.
All right, Marzi, you mentioned the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that imposed restrictions, didn't it, on Iran's nuclear program, and seemed to be working okay. But then Donald Trump pulled out of it in 2018. Marzi, where do you think, would we be where we are now, do you think, if the US president had kept the United States within the agreement?
Well, that is a very easy prediction. This is exactly what we saw until 2018, and even Iran fully commit to the deal, even the whole year after US would withdraw from the deal. Iran only started to partially withdraw from its commitment after being confident that Europe is not doing their part of the deal. They're not helping Iran to benefit from the deal. And if the sanctions haven't been reimposed on Iran, I can tell you what would have happened. Iran's economy would have been a lot better today, and there was no need for Iran to increase the stockpile of uranium. And it's not just that. Even globally, we would have seen a very, very big shift in the world. So prior to 2015, the reason that we have Germany in the P5+1 negotiated team was because Germany was Iran's biggest economic partner. So as other guests mentioned, now Iran has a very eastward viewpoint. This was not prior to the US sanctions on Iran. This did not happen prior to the it happened after the 2015 and 2018 US withdrawal. So Iran would not be under the umbrella of China as it is now. We would have been a very different world order. Now Iran has no choice but to be with China and Russia and sell us all to China.
Ellie, what's your thought about that? Is this a problem that has already been solved back in the day with the JCPOA?
Well, look, the 12-day war was a very expensive war for the US and Israel, and it actually risked dragging the United States into a broader regional conflict with Iran had the US president not called quits after those strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. But it was unprecedented, and from all the intelligence that has become available at the moment, that conflict set back Iran's nuclear program by a year or two at best. Now, the nuclear deal in 2015 set back Iran's program for a year without a single shot being fired and providing the West actually economic opportunities in Iran. So for me, it's a no-brainer in terms of the cost-benefit calculations of how you set back the perceived threat from Iran's nuclear program through diplomacy versus a military confrontation. Now, my concern, as I highlighted before, is that snapback may feed an escalatory dynamic now with Iran and Israel, and may be used as justification by Israel now to go back in to a bombardment campaign in Iran to, for example, take out Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium, which the Europeans were trying to negotiate over as part of this snapback extension deal, but failed to make a breakthrough. And the key question, if Israel does decide to start that conflict, is whether it can drag back the Trump administration into it, and to what extent Iran will hit back.
This is an important point, isn't it, Mark? This question of 409 kilos, nearly 409 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that the IAEA says the country has. We don't know where it is. Iran isn't saying where it is. How important is that in the whole build-up, the shape of this?
Oh, it's a very important consideration in a couple of different ways. One is that if Iran were to decide to produce nuclear weapons, and there's no indication that they've ever made a decision actually to do that. But if they were to decide to do it, that 400 kilograms would be an essential part of their program, because it is the wherewithal to produce 10 bombs worth of highly enriched uranium. It's also very important in diplomacy. You know, the E3 were trying to persuade Iran to turn over that highly enriched uranium, to downblend it or ship it out of the country to remove that potential threat. And Iran wouldn't do it because they view it as a great leverage for them. And they wanted to extract more than just a 3-month or 6-month delay in imposition of sanctions. But here's one other thing. If Iran were to try to remove the canisters of HEU from the rubble of Natanz, where I think they probably are, Israel would probably learn about that because they penetrated Iran so badly. And then I think Israel would bomb. So the leverage that Iran might think it has from the HEU might not be such great leverage because it can't do anything with those canisters right now.
Right. So what of the diplomatic track? Ellie, you've written that the E3 are now at a fork in the road. Why is that?
So look, I think that they can now, having used up Snapback as a main tool of leverage for them, they can either pivot to creating a soft landing to de-escalate tensions with Tehran and find a series of perhaps small deals that can just do some damage limitation in the coming 6 months. Or they could try and join, which I am worried about actually, the sort of Marco Rubio US maximum pressure campaign against Iran, which has this vision that if only you just dial up the pressure and isolate Iran just that little bit more, the Iranian leadership would cave and capitulate to this idea that it should dismantle its nuclear program and have a zero enrichment policy. Now, in my view, Iran, that has just undergone war with both Israel and the US, is very unlikely to do that without putting up a much bigger resistance and a much bigger fight. And so from a European perspective, and I think this should go beyond the so-called E3 countries because it impacts European security at large, there needs to be a broader coalition of countries that now pivot to, look, how can we dial down the temperature with Tehran? How can we find a series of band-aid measures that can address some of the key nuclear concerns with Iran, with the knowledge that the E3 and the Europeans are going to have to nudge the US administration towards some sort of trade-off, even if it's very small to begin with. But this is the fork I'm talking about, and I do hope that the Europeans take their traditional role of a fire break between Iran and the US and Israel and prevent another conflict from potentially emerging.
Marzi, Ellie mentioned there Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State. In fact, what he said was Snapback does not contradict our earnest readiness for diplomacy. It only enhances it. That's what the US Secretary of State says. So what, in your view, will it take for Iran now, after all of this, to come to the negotiating table?
Well, the Snapback was not about diplomacy. A Snapback was just about pressure. It's just about showing Iran of its one-sidedness nature, to show that it's pressure without reciprocity. It shows that powerful countries will only want the less powerful countries to comply without giving them any of the benefits that even were promised within the deal. It's very hard to say what will be coming next because Iranians have a very strong historical memory, and what happened is just reinforcing the hardline conservatives' viewpoint in Iran that US and the West cannot be trusted. It's exactly what they were saying even way before 2015 deal. And how can we continue? It's whether the international community can rebuild credibility, because without it, even small steps becomes almost impossible.
Indeed, a big issue of trust here, Mark, isn't there? We had this round of nuclear talks between the US and Iranian officials set to take place on June the 15th, but then Israeli bombs started falling on Tehran 2 days before the scheduled negotiations, postponing them indefinitely. And so now we are where we're at. And how does anybody trust anybody?
Yeah, certainly trust is in low supply, and that trust totally obliterated by the bombing, even while negotiations were being planned, and trust earlier being undercut by Trump pulling out of the deal. But it's interesting that, despite those actions by the United States and Israel, Iran was still trying to engage in some diplomacy with the E3. And we're willing to meet with the United States, maybe not directly, but with the Europeans. So Iran doesn't have too many other paths toward helping its economy and removing the threat of future war. So diplomacy really is their only game. And even though the JCPOA is now history, there could be other possibilities. They don't look very promising, but I would never give up on diplomacy.
Indeed. Ellie, does Iran have the weapon, though, if I could put it that way, of making the move that everybody would fear of pulling out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT?
Well, look, that's certainly been the threat that was put on the table under previous Iranian administrations. What has been interesting is that the current government of Masoud Pezeshkian over the summer has come out to essentially say that their commitments to the non-proliferation treaty is likely to continue even in the face of snapback, because this is, I think, something that also has created perhaps tensions between Eastern powers like Russia and China that would like to see Iran remain within the NPT framework. So Iran cannot at this point afford to burn its bridges with more world powers than it already has. Now, the Iranian parliament has put up a counter argument and put up a fight to say if snapback happens, Iran needs to essentially suspend and end all of its activities and cooperations with the international agency that monitors the nuclear program, and it should also go a step further and withdraw from the NPT. So far, what we've heard, even as snapback was looming, is that the Iranian government has said this will ultimately be a decision for higher bodies like the Supreme National Security Council and ultimately the Supreme Leader. And in recent days, the Supreme Leader has reiterated that Iran is committed to not having a nuclear weapon, to having a peaceful civil nuclear program. And so I would at this stage find it quite surprising if Iran does withdraw from the NPT, but we certainly can't rule it out.
Important conversation, but it's a conversation that we've run out of time to have. I do appreciate your time, all of you, Ellie, Geranmayeh, Mark Fitzpatrick and Mazi Khalilian. And thank you too for watching. You can find plenty more on this story and indeed the show itself on our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the entire team here, it's goodbye for now.